And in our own time, it seems to me the intense hatred of hashish and the efforts to eradicate it that reach hysterical proportions in our own country have nothing to do with the pharmacological impact of the drug or any deleterious effect that it might be perceived to have, but rather it is sensed as the carrier of a different set of cultural values, which I would broadly describe as Gaian or Gailanic or feminizing or androgynous, and that this is what really brings the opprobrium of the dominator society upon it. It is profoundly disloyal to the values of modern industrialism, where, for instance, a drug like caffeine, exemplified in coffee and tea, has been made very welcome in those same societies. I mean, no other drug other than caffeine has ever been written into the industrial contracts of workers as an inalienable right. And yet in the coffee break, we encounter contractually defined rights to drug use that seem to work in favor of both manager and worker. Cannabis is very different. It promotes a dreaminess. It promotes an abiding in the imagination that is the stuff of romantic poetry rather than the stuff of the modern assembly line. And I've used it that way as a tool for creativity. I mean, it's incredible how just a few puffs of cannabis can carry you over a creative problem or a block in seeing a particular problem, so that suddenly the perspective shifts and what was previously occluded becomes patently obvious. So I think that there's a great argument for above and beyond the well-known and familiar arguments for legalizing this drug, that it would provide revenue for governments, that it would decriminalize a class of people who, if it weren't for their devotion to cannabis products, would be seen to be among the most law-abiding of all classes within society. These arguments are familiar and have been made very eloquently by other people. But behind that, there's a deeper issue, which is the zeitgeist, if you will, of cannabis, which carries a certain implied danger to establishment values, which put such a premium on clear-eyed hard work and Presbyterian rectitude.
This is certainly associated in my own experience with the fact that the mental expansion is bought at the price of a certain physical lethargy. So I wonder if that's been your experience.
Actually, it hasn't. I'm interested in the question. It has to be said that cannabis is chemically complicated. It's not simply one cannabinol. There are a number of these cannabinoids, and various strains have various ratios and proportions of these things. But, for instance, I find when I'm writing books that I can only write for about 3 hours, and then either the day is finished for work, or I smoke hashish, and 20 minutes later I'm ready to go 2 hours more at it. And I can do that twice in a day. If I judiciously control my intake of cannabis, it gives me a second wind and a third wind to go forward with creative activity. Now, if you just sit down and smoke into stupor, you're not going to be able to do this. But if you just stop this now tiresome and boring activity and have a couple of puffs, and then you sit and you have a few interesting thoughts, and you feel completely revitalized and able to go back to it. And I've noticed this not only with creative work, but with physical work. For instance, if I'm stacking wood, I'll stack half a cord of wood, and then I'll either think, well, I'll finish stacking it tomorrow, and then I'll go in and smoke some cannabis. And a half hour later I'll say, well, why wait till tomorrow? I'll just go and finish it right now. I think you all know Paul Bowles' book, or the statement that a puff of keef makes a man strong as 20 camels in the courtyard. There's something to this. It's not simple. It can turn you into a stupor, sort of lazy, loutish person. On the other hand, it can allow you to do very hard work for very long periods of time. So you sort of have to manage it. And I think a lot of people don't learn to manage it. One of the things that's always put against marijuana is that it destroys short-term, or it destroys your memory. Well, I dare say I have a prodigious memory, and I'm the heaviest smoker I've ever known, and my memory for dates, names of painters, writers, literary and scientific minutiae, odd vocabularies in specialized areas is very great, and I don't credit cannabis with that, but I certainly can't believe that it has damaged my ability to do this. Now, it is true that sometimes in a conversation you will lose your thread, but on the other hand, it gives you an equal power to brilliantly fake the situation and to pick up the thread and re-stitch together the narrative. The other point I might make that we haven't mentioned yet, or 2 points actually, is that I think it gives an extraordinary verbal facility. And this is actually what won me to it in the first place. My reputation as a public speaker is based on my supposedly dazzling oratorical abilities, but I come out of a peer group, a karass in Berkeley, where everyone was able to do what I do. Everyone seemed to be able to hold forth for hours on the most arcane subjects. And in fact, when I got into cannabis, the style of doing it that I enjoyed most was I ran a kind of cannabis salon, as it were. And people came and they smoked and they talked and talked and talked, and this is all we did was talk. And no recordings exist of that era, but I believe that the conversation was brilliant, wide-ranging, prescient, to the point, and extraordinarily creative and capable of astonishing. And I give complete credit to cannabis for that. I remember the second time that I smoked cannabis, I was a great fan of Herman Melville at that time, and my friend and I smoked some cannabis and then called on some young women at a dormitory that we were courting at that time, and we went into the visitors' room of the dormitory, and I was able to hold forth for an hour in a pseudo-Melvillian style. I created on the spot, without hesitation, a short story in the style of Herman Melville that was dazzling, apparently, to my hearers. Well, this is verbal facility of an extraordinary sort.